Hello, I'm Evely and I will tell you one story of a good viewing. There are moments when waking up from sleep feels unnatural, as if the boundaries between dreams and reality have blurred and you are no longer yourself. It was one of those mornings when the light seemed too bright, the silence too loud, and everything was just off. Nina awoke with a strange sense of discomfort, a feeling she couldn't quite place. The air around her felt thick, almost tangible, as if it were pressing down on her chest. She blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the remnants of a nightmare that clung to the edges of her consciousness. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, long and distorted, like they were alive. But it wasn't the shadows that made her skin crawl. It was something else. She groaned softly as she slowly sat up in bed, her head spinning for a moment. The room, dim and cluttered as usual, felt alien to her today. It wasn't just the weird quietness that clung to the air or the way her sheets felt wrong beneath her. There was something in her body, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Nina's eyes snapped to her hands. Her left hand hovered above her stomach and she stared at it, heart racing. It looked different. She slowly brought it closer to her face, her breathing shallow. The fingers seemed too long, thinner than they should have been. The skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, as though the veins underneath were pushing too hard against the surface. A sickly greenish tint faintly marred the tips of her fingers, making them look as if they had been dipped in some kind of decay. She rubbed them against her leg, expecting them to feel soft, but they were stiff, unyielding. A chill ran up her spine, and she jerked her hand back, dropping it onto the bed. Her whole body felt strange. Her arms, her entire frame, was different. She raised her right arm and stared at it, unable to reconcile the fact that it was hers. Her skin, now stretched too tight across her bones, seemed too thin. The arms felt like they were hers, but not hers. They seemed too long, too angular. Her fingertips brushed against her neck, and she winced. Her skin was unnaturally smooth, almost slick. Her heart began to pound in her chest. She felt something inside her, a rhythm that wasn't hers. It wasn't the steady beat of her heart, but a slow, rasping movement, as though something were trying to crawl beneath her skin. She looked down at her stomach, the sensation growing stronger, and her stomach tightened in response, nausea rising in her throat. What is happening to me?" she whispered, her voice shaky. She clutched at her stomach, hoping that somehow the pressure would ease the feeling inside her. But as her fingers dug into her skin, she felt it again, something shifted under the surface. It wasn't a spasm. It was purposeful. Something was alive inside her. A sharp, guttural sound escaped from her throat as she pulled her hands away, gasping for air. Her breath came in quick, ragged bursts. The room felt too small, too suffocating. The walls pressed in on her, the ceiling seeming lower than it should have been. Nina stumbled to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her as if they were no longer quite her own. The room was still shrouded in half-light, and for a moment she thought she saw something dart across the corner of her vision, a flicker of movement. Her pulse quickened. The sensation in her body intensified, and for the first time she truly felt as if she was not alone inside herself. Her reflection caught her eye. She stumbled toward the full-length mirror on the wall, her movements jerky and uncertain. She reached out, her fingers brushing the glass as she leaned closer to inspect her reflection. The pale girl staring back at her looked wrong. Her skin was too taut across her bones, and her eyes, wide with terror, seemed too large for her face. But it wasn't her face that caught her attention. It was the dark, veiny lines that marred the surface of her skin, stretching across her arms, her neck, and even her face. The veins pulsed, visibly active, as though something was feeding off the blood beneath them, moving in time with that strange, rhythmic breathing that came from within her. A sharp pain sliced through her chest, and Nina gasped, stumbling backward. Her breathing grew more rapid, her vision blurring at the edges. Her fingers curled, not in a way that she consciously commanded, but as if they were moving on their own accord, twitching, stretching unnaturally. And then she heard it. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't from outside the room. It came from inside her. A horrible, gnawing sound, like something large and hungry was trying to claw its way out from deep within her body. Nina staggered away from the mirror, pressing her hands against the walls to steady herself. The growling noise grew louder, and she felt it, a tremor that seemed to echo from the inside of her chest. The rhythmic breathing was growing quicker, more urgent. She looked around, desperate for answers, but there were no answers. Nothing made sense. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and she shivered violently. She could see her breath in the air now, the cold seeping into her bones. But it wasn't just cold. It was wrong. There was something alive in the coldness, something unnatural that seemed to wrap itself around her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch, stretch, and bend in unnatural ways. Nina's heart thundered in her chest as she stumbled to the door. She reached for the handle, but her hands weren't working the way they should have been. Her fingers were trembling too much, and when she tried to grip the doorknob, it slipped from her grasp as if her hand had become too thin to hold onto anything. She tried again. And again. But no matter how hard she gripped, the knob twisted under her touch, slipping out of reach. It wasn't her fingers that were failing her, she realized. It was something else, something that was pulling her hands, pulling her body in the wrong direction. A horrible, intrusive force tugged at her every movement. "Please," she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, let me out." And then, with a sudden, shocking burst of energy, the door opened of its own accord. Nina staggered backward, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway stretched out in front of her, but it wasn't the hallway she remembered. The air was thick, oppressive, like something heavy was pressing down on her from above. The walls, once familiar, were covered in strange, dark stains, patches that seemed to move, shifting and writhing like something alive. The floor beneath her feet creaked, groaned as though it was about to collapse under her weight. The sound in her chest grew louder, the growl almost deafening now, as if something inside her was starting to claw its way to the surface. And that was when she felt it. A presence behind her. The shadows behind her twisted into something more solid, something monstrous. It had shape now, something large and looming, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dimness. Nina froze. The growl had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Something was waiting for her to make the next move, and it was clear that it wasn't something she could outrun. Before she could react, a sudden, intense pain shot through her body, coursing from her stomach outward. It felt like fire, like ice, like every nerve in her body was being stretched to its breaking point. She screamed, a ragged sound that tore through the silence of the hallway. Her body was changing again, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Nina's scream echoed through the hallway, but it didn't sound like her own. It was distorted, raw, as if her very vocal cords were being stretched out of their normal limits. The pain intensified, twisting through her insides, growing, surging with an unstoppable force. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, clutching her stomach. She gasped for air, but it was like the air itself was being sucked away from her. Her body, her own body, was betraying her, reshaping in ways that she couldn't comprehend. The growl inside her had returned, louder this time, almost jubilant, like a beast that was finally going to be free. It felt as if something were moving inside her, beneath the skin, slithering, contorting, pressing against her ribs. She felt something sharp and long dig into her side, and she screamed again, the sound now more animal than human. Her fingers twitched, extending involuntarily, reaching toward her abdomen. She could feel it, the thing that was trying to break free. Her body felt as though it were being torn apart from the inside out, every inch of her skin pulling in different directions. Her hands scraped across the floor, nails leaving marks in the wood as she tried to push herself away from the torment inside her. But then there was a shift, a release, like a dam breaking. The thing within her seemed to exhale, a thick, wet sound, and for a moment Nina thought it was over. The pressure inside her ebbed, but only for a second. Then it moved again. A sharp, cracking noise echoed from her chest as something inside her split apart. A dark, liquid stain began to spread across her shirt, soaking through the fabric. The sensation was unbearable. It was as though the walls of her body were caving in on themselves. She gasped, her breath ragged, her vision spinning. The shadows in the hallway seemed to darken, warping as she looked at them. Her legs were shaking, but she managed to push herself up, barely able to keep her balance. She stumbled toward the stairs, every step in agony as the thing within her seemed to claw and gnaw, forcing her to move in ways she didn't understand. It was as if her own body was no longer her own. A sudden flash of movement caught her eye. She whipped her head toward the edge of the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure stood there, just outside the reach of the light, its silhouette barely visible against the shadows. "Who?" Nina's voice was cracked and raw, barely a whisper. Her throat was too dry to speak properly. But she knew, deep in her gut, that the figure was not there to help. No one would help her. Not anymore. The figure shifted, and her stomach twisted with a fresh surge of panic. It wasn't human, there was no way it could be. Its limbs were too long, too spindly, the joints at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting an eerie green light that made Nina's blood run cold. And then, the worst part, the part that sent a flood of horror through her veins, was the way it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, silently, as if the air itself bent around it. The floor beneath Nina's feet groaned with each step she took toward the stairs, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She could feel it coming closer, feel the heat of its presence as it closed the distance. The figure was not just moving toward her, it was moving into her, through her, as if it were drawn to her very soul. Nina turned and bolted down the hallway, her heart beating so loudly that it drowned out every other sound. But even as she ran, she could feel the thing inside her, thrashing, trying to make its presence known, forcing her to slow down, to fall, to collapse in on herself. She couldn't escape it. At the stairs, she almost stumbled, catching herself on the railing. Her vision blurred, her head spinning, and she felt as though the world was twisting around her. She reached for the wall, trying to steady herself, but her hand slipped and she fell down the first few steps. Her body hit the floor with a sickening thud. Get up, she screamed, but the voice didn't even sound like hers anymore. It was deep, hoarse, as though it were being dragged from the very pit of her stomach. She dragged herself up, ignoring the sting of pain that shot through her arms and legs. Her body was no longer just changing, it was breaking apart. Her joints felt like they were snapping, her bones dislocating and reconfiguring, shifting beneath her skin. The thing inside her was relentless, devouring everything that made her human. Her breath came in desperate gasps as she crawled toward the door that led outside. She reached for the handle, but her too thin hand, slipped from it, the long, skeletal fingers no longer able to grip anything. She was too weak to open it. Her nails scraped against the metal, but it was no use. The shadows behind her flickered again. She turned her head to see the figure moving toward her, closer now. Its eyes gleamed, glowing bright green in the dark. And then, without warning, it spoke. "Help me," the voice was low and rasping, a strange, inhuman whisper that felt like it was coming from inside her own skull. Nina's heart skipped a beat. It was her voice. But it wasn't her voice. It was something else, something dark and twisted, something that echoed inside her, a reflection of the thing clawing at her from within. "No. No," she gasped, shaking her head. Please, let me out." The thing inside her responded with a movement so violent that Nina's entire body jerked forward as though it had taken control of her. She felt the sharpness of its will, the way it pulled at her mind, the way it was trying to force her to become something else, something more. Suddenly a wet, horrible cracking sound erupted from her chest. Nina screamed, falling to the ground as she felt her ribs begin to split apart. Her skin stretched and tore as something massive pushed its way to the surface. Something was emerging from her. She tried to scream again, but the sound was choked off, replaced by a guttural, monstrous growl that vibrated through her entire being. Her vision swam, her eyes widening in horror as the thing inside her, this horrible, inhuman thing, pushed itself free. And then, in the midst of the pain and the horror, she saw it. The creature, once a part of her, crawled out of her body, slithering from her chest like a mass of writhing, blackened tendrils. Its shape was amorphous, its limbs bending in ways that no human form ever could, its mouth opening wide to reveal sharp, jagged teeth. It was alien, monstrous, and it was free. Nina's scream cut through the air, but it was too late. The thing had escaped. And now it was no longer inside her. It was out. And it was hungry. Thank you very much and see you all in the next video.